Thank you, and to everyone at Samita and Buddhist Insights for supporting this, and a special welcome to the Venerables who are joining us here today. Okay, so yes, so I feel like I'm on a lot of pressure here because it's all about joy. So it's when you're a Buddhist monk, you have to like walk the walk, right? So I should be happy, I guess, when I'm giving this, and sometimes it doesn't work out like that. I remember when I was in shortly after I'd first arrived in Sydney, and I had to give a Dhamma talk on metta. Well, I'll say I had to give a Dhamma talk. I was giving a Dhamma talk on metta, and I'd been through a very stressful experience when I was just shortly after starting at the Santi Monastery, and I had probably the only full-blown migraine I've ever had in my life, and it was really bad. And I had a lot of sympathy for people who get migraines, because this was like really bad and I just wanted to vomit. And I was sitting there giving the talk about metta and everyone being kind and feeling all of this joy and everything, and then just basically just ran out of it and afterwards. Anyway, so that's just a little anecdote about the life of a Dhamma teacher. So right, so today talk about joy. Now, I think just checking in, I think, first of all, can I just get everybody, as much as possible, to just check in via the chat and just share us a few words, if you can, about where you're at and how you're feeling now. And because, it's good to just create a bit of a personal connection. So if you've got a few words that you can just share with the group via the chat session, then that would be nice. I'm just going to say in here. Okay, so I just put in there that I've been at my dad's house for the last week, and in fact, after the last session finished, I got on a train the next morning and went up. My father lives in Coffs Harbour. It's somewhat up the north coast, about 9 hours on the train. And, oh, good, Olivia, well done. Yes, well, this is not very compassionate for the poor folks on the West Coast, but you made it. Excellent. Yeah, so I went up to my dad's, and he's in a beautiful, like, woodland property in the hills in Coffs Harbour, kind of subtropical region. And my sister was there also, so we had a really nice few days together. His house, of course, was, like the whole of Australia, was very threatened by the bushfires last year. And he's getting on. He's over. He wrote me in an email that I called him the other day, and he said he was so happy to hear from me. He said it made him feel so good. He felt like he was 80 again. So, so anyway, he's doing okay. So good to hear from Olivia, to hear from Mark. Yeah, good to have you here as well, Christian and Sabina. Relaxed, nice and sunny weather. Oh, lucky you. Here in Sydney, it's cold and rainy. This is very strange for this time of year, but yeah. Elizabeth, live in the USA, voted yesterday. Congratulations, well done. Hopeful for change, but concerned I'm setting myself up for disappointment. Yes. Anyway, thank you for doing your bit. Miko, doing fine, just visiting my parents. So Miko, he's in his car there, so that's good. Just like keep some focus, all right? So if you've got to be driving, then just do the driving part, okay? Tara just had a test, came back negative, COVID test, okay. Right, okay, oh, I'm good to hear that, yeah. Esther, you got a migraine? That's no good. So sorry. I didn't know you got migraines. Sydney and Eco, nice walks through the forest and meditations. Oh, that also sounds very wonderful. Anne-Marie, feeling pretty joyful. Anne-Marie's birthday. Oh, my goodness. Happy birthday. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And have you had a special party or anything for your birthday? Buddhists, we tend to be a bit boring on birthdays, don't we? Hilda's mentioned that she's been caught in various different kinds of moments trying to be back to myself again. Yeah. I wish you luck in your journey back to yourself. It can be the longest journey that we make. So Flavio's near Bern, Switzerland. Is happy. Meditation, good. Katrine, for today, a day of silence in Belgium. Okay. Lovely walk with friends. Happy, good. All good here. Empty Cloud. Just finished our week from Venerable Sumano, participating in the Western Buddhist monastic gathering on Zoom. Oh, okay. Oh, nice. I'm glad you managed to take part in that. I was at that meeting only once, many years ago. We had a meeting in California, but that was a nice time. Kali, Jay, honeybees on native plants in the backyard. Joy this week, right along with honeybees. Great. Honeybees they're okay. They're not going to, as long as, and Edward from YouTube says hello. So I'll tell you a story about bees. Like, I know it can be dangerous if you're allergic or whatever, but when I was staying in Thailand, like I stayed in a kuti for a year in northern Thailand, in Nan, and one of the features of that kuti, I think I talked about that kuti before, but one of the features of that kuti was there was a beehive, and every afternoon I used to sit outside on the balcony and drink a cup of coffee and read a little bit and just sort of enjoy sitting out and having a bit of a break. I was mostly just meditating all day. And but there was a beehive there, and when I was sitting there, the bees would come and just land on me, and it was quite hot there in northern Thailand, so that they enjoyed like drinking the sweat. So you're sort of sweating and the bees will come, and after a while you just get so used to it that you just like, it's just kind of normal. You don't even think about it. And it's just something that you gradually learn from being in nature, that nature isn't something to be feared. I mean, not to say there aren't scary things in nature. I mean, I'm from Australia, but most of the time nature is actually pretty okay. So these bees would just come and they just crawl around, and when I was reading, and then I'd go back, and it was never a problem. I never even really thought about it. And then one day I got a visitor, and he came to see me, and we were just sitting chatting, and I was just sitting there, and these bees sort of landed on me, and you could see this visitor is getting like really freaked out, very, very uncomfortable. And that was the first time that it struck me, like how much like that kind of perception had shifted. You know, maybe it's because I've been, been a vegetarian for such a long time. You know, maybe I've been practicing metta and practicing, mindfulness and so on. So I don't know why, but that perception changes. Okay, so for this week, I'm going to talk about the topic of joy, and I'm just going to begin by briefly reviewing the last two sessions and a brief introduction. I think most of the people here have been at the previous sessions. Is that right? Is there anyone here who's not been at any of the previous sessions? I think most people have been at some of them. I'll just briefly remind you where we've come from. So one of the starting points of this whole series of talks has been, of course, my own sort of very deep personal, Mark's first time, okay, good, welcome, my own kind of deep personal concern and anxiety about the future of where we're going with climate change and all of the other threats to our way of life, our civilization, our perhaps our survival. And I wanted to try to create a space for having a conversation about these things that would not be either too much about the science, right? So I don't want to talk too much about the science of climate change. There's plenty of forums for talking about that. I also don't want to kind of get distracted into activist sort of rhetoric. You know, I'm not here to make you do anything. Okay. I personally, I think you should do something, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't do anything. Obviously you should, but I wanted to do something that would be more personal and more reflective, and about how I'm trying to find my way through this and trying to find my way to understand it with the Buddha's teachings as a guide and a framework. But I'm wary of like pat answers, of just overly simplistic answers to things, because they it seems to me that this is a problem that requires a much deeper response, and requires a more careful consideration of how our morality and our values are going to be applied in the future. In the first talk, I talked about life, and I proposed that where much of the rhetoric around response to the threat of climate change and other existential threats was to insist that we must have hope, and in contrast with the doomerist position, the hopists versus the doomists, then I tried to say to me, a more useful way of framing it is to look at the value of life. And when we look at the value of life, we are coming back to a fundamental moral tenet of Buddhism, first precept, but also of people in general. And life is something which is uniquely valuable and in which we participate. We have all of the wonderful space telescopes and all of these things, radio telescopes for exploring the galaxy now. And we might find life somewhere else. But one of the things that we have found so true is that life is very rare. And in all of the world that we've looked at so far, we haven't found it. Yeah? And probably there is life in other places, but it's very, very rare. And we have to treasure this planet and this place, because this is all we've got. So that was the first talk. The second one I took on the topic of love. And I posited that in this time when fear and hate are seemingly on the rise, and where they are, where fear-driven responses to things seem to become more and more normalized, that it's even more important for us to remember that love beats hate, and love is always more powerful and more meaningful as a response, and not just in a nice sounding airy-fairy way, but in a very practical way, because love and the connection between people is the basis for cooperation. It's the basis for working together. And whatever the future that lies ahead, a future where we can love each other and work with each other is going to be better than one where we don't do those things. So this is briefly where we've come to in the journey so far. And so for today, I want to talk about the topic of joy. And now, as I did previously, I would like to try to frame this in terms of how we're looking at understanding this, how it seems from a Buddhist perspective, and also how it seems from a personal perspective. Now, I'm sure that you've all seen and all kind of well aware that there's a lot of, there's a big kind of happiness industry in the world today. So there's a lot of people who are very invested in making people happy. And a lot of positive psychology, which is invested in making people happy, and all of these kinds of things. Now, that kind of happiness and positivity project has its own history, of course. And like much of the cultural perspectives that we've evolved in the modern world, especially from a European-centric point of view, it has its roots in something specific within a European, a Western, and Christian background. Now, to briefly sort of put it in terms of my own experience and my own explorations, my first real understanding of this comes from reading Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was in the 19th century, and if you haven't read his books, and you read a couple of them, they're very good, entertaining, and very dynamic writer. I first read Nietzsche when I was like a 15-year-old schoolboy at a Catholic school, which is the perfect time to read Nietzsche. And to get a book called, to go from your Christian Brothers school and then get a book called The Antichrist was, I mean, come on, right? I mean, that was like perfect. But one of the things that I learned from Nietzsche was that he spoke about this kind of deadening and life-sapping force in what he perceived of as the Christianity at his time. And without, so I don't want to sort of do it as a critique of Christianity or to endorse what Nietzsche was saying or not what he was saying, but there's something to that. And there's something to that sense of that in a spiritual life, that sense of vitality and strength and joy, which Nietzsche was trying to bring to things. And I think that I personally believe that since that time that Christianity, modern forms of Christianity have largely accepted that Nietzsche was actually right and have reformed themselves to be much more joyful expressions of religiosity. They'd never kind of say that, but I think they largely have done it. And I think that that this has sort of set up a dynamic in Western and European societies where we have on the one hand a tradition which in part was very repressive and quite cruel and quite joyless, and then we have opposed that with a much more joyful, a much more happy approach. Education is another field where the same thing has happened, where we've had a history of harsh schooling, harsh punishments, rigidity and so on, and then it's replaced by a much more kind of positive attitude of affirmation and so on. And look, it's a good thing, but it's also a partial thing, because it's not always the case that just telling every kid you're great, your work is really excellent, is always a good thing. Sometimes it's better to say, no, actually, that wasn't very good for these reasons, and you can do better. So this kind of positivity thing is like anything, when taken to an extreme, can become an absolute. Now, in spirituality, and again, I think, I personally believe, as a result, ultimately, of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, the idea of positivity and happiness has become almost like a kind of a mandate in Buddhism, in spiritual circles generally, but especially in Buddhism. And I think Buddhists have also been concerned to escape the whole kind of problem of the Four Noble Truths, right? We're all about suffering, and that's always a bit kind of no, and we need to sort of try to present things in a more positive way, or there's that felt need to do that. And my own teacher, Ajahn Brahm, was one of the first people to do that in the 90s when he was presenting Dhamma, and he talked about the Four Noble Truths was the happiness, the origin of happiness, the ending of happiness, and the path to what was the things that were blocking happiness. And so he sort of turned the Four Noble Truths upside down as a way of reframing it. And so, again, it's not that there's a kind of a right or a wrong way, but it's just understanding that this is a perspective on things, and that much of how Buddhism has been presented has been kind of like a spiritual Prozac. It's there to give you a bit of a lift, make you feel good, and you can go home feeling a bit nice, which is fine. It's much better to have a spiritual Prozac than a chemical one, right? Much better. So it's not actually wrong with that, but that's not all there is. That's a starting point, and that's somewhere that we can bring people on and get them interested, but there's much more to Buddhism than that. One of the downsides I find personally of that approach, and that positivity approach, is that it then becomes, if you want to accept that there are actually bad things happening, then that's a moral failing. And everything becomes just very subjective. Oh yes, well, you subjectively feel that there's something bad happening with climate change. Well, somebody else doesn't subjectively feel that, right? And so we have this. We turn everything into what is your feelings about everything. And I'm like, no, there's actually there's actually fires that are objectively burning. and glaciers that are like objectively not existing anymore, and these kinds of things. So it's not all just about your attitude to it. There's a reality, and so we need to maintain that perspective of being able to look at the reality of things. Now, for me, this was one of the things that got me most interested in Buddhism from the start. And I never came to Buddhism through that kind of normal way of looking at things. And I didn't sort of do sort of mindfulness retreats and, these kinds of things. I wasn't reading Jack Cornfield or these kinds of things, which might be like a normal way that somebody in the West might come to Buddhism, or reading the Dalai Lama or something like that. I was just in Thailand, running short of cash, and the monastery was a cheap place to stay. So I ended up doing these very intensive retreats. And they didn't like happiness at all in these retreats, I'd have to say. They were not interested in making you feel good. And so that was my kind of baptism of fire. And so for me, whether that's suitable for everyone, I can't say, but for me, that was really useful. And I appreciated right from the beginning the fact that the Buddha said, no, there is suffering, it's real. And again, for myself, I can compare it coming from a Catholic background where the problem of evil is always a great theological problem. Right? If God created the world and the world is good, why are there bad things in the world? From a Buddhist point of view, that's not a problem, that's the problem. That's the issue, the issue of suffering and evil in the world. That's what we're here for. So that's not a side issue. And the Buddha, of course, made a response to that. And so for me, my own path was to experience that suffering, and to have some faith, because I could see that what the Buddha was talking about was genuinely the things that I was experiencing in my life. And the Buddha wasn't judging me for not being happy. He wasn't saying that you have some kind of moral obligation to always see things positively. He just said, this is how the world is. And when I saw that, I felt some faith. And through my practice, then I learned to experience joy because of that, very paradoxically. And curiously enough, it wasn't until some time later that I sort of discovered the formulation of this in one of the suttas. And this kind of thing is actually talked about quite a lot in the suttas, but there was one particular sutta called the Upanisa Sutta in the Nidana Samyutta, and that has the phrase Dukkhupanisa Sadha Sadhupanisa Pamojam. So suffering gives rise to faith, and faith gives rise to joy. And that was my path. That's exactly how it happened with me. When we see and when we experience suffering and pain, we shouldn't hide away from it. That is the reality. That's the primary fact of our world. And when we hear the Buddha talking about that, the Buddha placed the Four Noble Truths at the very heart of his teaching: suffering, origin of suffering, the ending of suffering, and the path leading to the ending of suffering. When we hear that, then we have a possibility, right? A possibility that maybe we can do something about it. Maybe this all of this pain and all of this struggle that we see around us, maybe there's a way through it. Maybe there's a way we can respond to it. And so this is what spurs our practice. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every moment is just joy. It doesn't mean that that practice isn't difficult or painful or whatever. But it does mean once you've experienced that joy of letting go, then it means that you've discovered something. You've found some wisdom. And if even once you have sat in meditation, doesn't even have to be meditation, but let's say you've sat in meditation and you've experienced that moment of letting go, and you've experienced the joy that comes from that letting go, then you know what that joy means. You know what the joy of the spiritual path is. And nobody can take that away from you. Nobody ever can take that away from you. I mean, they can take it away in the short term, right? Somebody can come up and yell your name or something like that and pull you out of your meditation. But nobody can take that knowledge away from it. You know that you can experience that joy. And that tells us something very profound about our nature as human beings. In the world, people are always telling us that we will be happy when we get something, right? When we have something. And, this is what the basis of the advertising industry is. The most basic kind of ad you can get, a happy person drinking a can of Coke or something like that, and that's going to make me happy. So if I'm going to do the same thing, I'll also be happy. And when we look at that, and we look at that, all of that effort that goes in to creating desire, creating that kind of illusory kind of happiness, and in a way it can feel almost hopeless to think that how can we counter that? How can we tell people that there is a real spiritual happiness that they can get by letting go, when so many forces are telling them exactly the opposite message? But I believe that would be a misunderstanding. No. The very fact that they have to spend so much money to convince people to buy stuff tells us that this is not natural. You see, it's not natural. And the people who would preach about materialism and capitalism and so on, they would say this is just human nature. Human nature is desire. Human nature is to want things, and human beings become happy because they get the things that they want. If that was the case, you'd never have to advertise anything. But it's not human nature. Actually, human nature, according to the Buddha, is conditioned. That's all. Human nature isn't essentially anything. It's conditioned. And human beings live in all kinds of ways. And some human beings live in ways where they're constantly grasping and wanting to get more and more and more. And there are plenty of other human beings who don't live like that at all. And we have been put into this place where we're almost assumed that we have to accept that this kind of model of humanity is the kind of the realistic one. It's the default one. Oh yes, people are like that. You have to give people what they want. But it's just not true. And it's weird how how shallow the models of people's understanding of human beings are. I see this sometimes with advertisements on the internet. See, I very rarely see ads on the internet because I use an ad blocker. So I very rarely see them. But then when I see them, I'm like, I'm like, why are you trying to sell me things? I'm a Buddhist monk. I don't have any money. I've literally never bought anything for 25 years. I'm not interested in your new clothes. I'm not interested in your holidays. I'm not interested in all of these things. I will never click on any of your ads. I've never clicked on an ad in the last 15 or 20 years I've been using the internet. What a reasonable person would give up. They would say, oh, why bother giving this person ads? No, he's a lost cause. But no, they keep on coming. They keep on trying. And these are supposed to be the AIs, the really intelligent people who are doing all of this market research and understanding people and targeting and all of these kind of complete rubbish. They can't even understand basic facts about humanity. So the fact that our society spends so much effort to amplify desire, actually there's a ray of hope in there. If we have to work so hard to create desire, then maybe it's just as natural for people to not have so much desire. Maybe it's natural for people to just be content. And there are plenty of people in the world who are content. And in fact, most of the world's indigenous populations, people living in villages and all of these kinds of things, there are many people all over the world who've lived very simple lives and who, by and large, are reasonably content with them. What stops people from being content? I'm not trying to say it's perfect, right? I don't want to romanticize about it, okay? And we have to be very careful about this. There was a story in Australia, there's a story from of the last Aboriginal family who came in from the desert, and that was in the early 1970s, if I recall correctly. And there was the last family who'd been wandering around just living off the land in the desert, and they contacted some of their relatives, and they brought them to a station. And they were thirsty, they wanted a drink, and they turned the tap on and water came out of the tap. And it was the first time that they'd seen this. And they were just so shocked, and they were so angry with their relatives. Why didn't you tell us about this before? And they do a ritual where they will spear someone in the leg, right, as a punishment. And so they speared their relative in the leg as a punishment for not showing them the water that came out of the tap before. So look, I don't want to romanticize kind of a life of tribal people or village people. It's very hard, and there's a lot of hard work and so on. But that doesn't mean that people can't also be content. And it doesn't mean that we can't be content with a lot less. And it's something that I learned very early on in my monk's life. I mean, actually, I've never really been interested in things, and I've never owned a lot of possessions or anything like that. But when I became a monk, on my first rains retreat, I stayed at a monastery called Pujamgom in the easternmost tip of Thailand, and just a very, very simple hut, plain wooden floor. They would make the huts there. Mostly the huts were made from just the materials they would find around them. So a couple of the guys from the village would come, they'd chop down some bamboo, and they would get a machete and cut strips off the bamboo, and they make strips about 1 centimeter wide, and then they would weave those strips together to make like a thatch, and then they'd use that to make the walls. And then the roof would be made from grass, but they'd go out and they'd cut the grass, dry it, and then fold it over together and do that. Then they would source logs from dead trees around in the forest, saw them up. And the only thing that they really didn't get locally would be the floorboards. So they would get them from town. Mostly the floorboards would be, recycled from some other building or something. And it would take them 2 or 3 days, and they'd put up quite a nice hut to live in. And then I'd stayed in this hut, and there was just a straw mat, my bowl, my robes, a steel cup to drink water out of, probably a bottle to keep some water, some gear for shaving, not so much. Just a few things. And I just remember sitting there one day and just looking around and thinking, there's this tiny little small hut that I was in, and yet it was just empty and there was nothing there. And I tried to think, is there anything more that I want? What actually do I want? And I couldn't think of anything. And I honestly couldn't think of anything that I wanted. I mean, these days I'm living in Sydney. It's a much flasher place. I have computers and electric lights. It's still pretty simple here, but it's much more flash than that old place. But still, I feel the same. People people are very kind, and they like to look after the monks, and they like to ask us, is there anything you want? Is there anything you need? And whenever people ask me that, I'm always sincere about it. I always try to think if there's something, but honestly, there's nothing that I want. It's okay. And so the pursuit of joy, or the pursuit of happiness through the acquisition of things and the acquisition of pleasure, is a luxury which we have created ourselves, and we have fueled this almost kind of feverish pursuit. We fuel this feverish pursuit literally by coal, by fossil fuels. We've created industry, we've created factories, we've created the ability to make all of these things. And just look around you right now. And I'm just looking in people's homes, most people staying in fairly simple places. It's not looking too fancy, but everywhere you look around you, the concrete in the walls, the bricks, the machined pieces of timber, the paints, the frames on the pictures or the windows, the glass, all of these things are produced by burning coal, basically. I mean, some of them by other fossil fuels and other means, but this is what makes these things. It's what, to make concrete, it takes a huge amount of energy. You have to dig up all of this stone, you have to grind it, and you have to bake it at like 1,000 or 1,500 degrees for a long time and transport it. It's a hugely energy intensive process. And we're surrounded by these things which have been made possible, these comforts that are made possible by literally burning coal. And that's all borrowed from the future. That's all unsustainable. We can't just keep on doing this. It's just not going to happen. No matter what we want, it's just not going to happen. We have to figure out a better way. And so so what kinds of things are we going to want to do in the future? Right? And I remember a statement back from the 90s after the Kyoto Agreement on climate change, and the United States didn't join that agreement, and George Bush Sr., if my memory serves me well, said the American way of life is not up for negotiation. Please, some Americans correct me if I'm wrong there. Yeah. American way of life is not up for negotiation. Yeah, well, sorry, it is actually, because you can't just keep on doing these things. And the Australian way of life, may I say. Australia has, I think, biggest size houses in the world, where no innocence when it comes to climate change by any means. All of us, our way of lives has to change, and how we seek happiness has to change. I mean, as a monk and as a spiritual teacher, to critique materialistic happiness, of course, that's more or less in the job description, right? That's what you expect. And often in Buddhism, it becomes convenient to, like if you look at how traditional Buddhist cultures work, because the Buddha wasn't a prude, right? The Buddha wasn't a killjoy. He was quite happy for people to enjoy their lives, right? You want to enjoy some good food, you want to enjoy your relationship, enjoy your family. That's fine. You could go and do those things, but just remember, you do it in moderation. That's all. And in Buddhist cultures, it's become convenient to put the virtue or the value of renunciation on the Sangha. So everyone in Buddhist cultures will accept the value of renunciation. It's good. It's a good thing. Yeah, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So the monks can do that, and that's great. And it becomes a very kind of easy, convenient way of doing that. And look, for most of history, that's probably okay, because people actually didn't have all that much, right? It's a different situation. But now we do have a lot. We really have to reconsider these things. What is the value of having cars and big houses and traveling and lots of clothes and lots of refined foods and all of those kinds of things if we don't have water? What's the point in these things if we don't have air? What's the point in these things if like literally the world is on fire? Why do we want to keep? Why we keep on kind of driving ourselves towards seeking this kind of happiness in this way that is just causing so much more pain in the long run? And one of the things that I think is like really a trap that we fall into when we're thinking about climate change is we want to have our cake and eat it too. And we want to have all the things that we've got, but we're just going to do it in a green way. And, you know, we're going to have flights, but we're going to make green airplanes. And we're going to have, big houses, but we'll build them in a green way, and all of those things. And look, to some degree, of course, that's possible. It's always possible to do things more efficiently or more effectively. But if we think that somehow we're going to pull out some magical technical fix, then I think we're going to be really disappointed. And if we look at the past, and if we look at the history of carbon emissions in particular, there's really only one thing that is actually effective at reducing carbon emissions on a global scale. Only one thing historically has done that, and that is shrinking economies. When you have a global financial crisis and the economies contract, the carbon emissions go down. That's it. That's the only actual proven way of reducing carbon emissions on a global scale. Right, on a national scale, particular industries, particular countries can reduce carbon emissions without slowing their economy. That's happened, but it hasn't happened on a global scale. And we don't actually have any proof that we can scale that up. I mean, we like to think that we can scale it up, but it's an untested hypothesis. The fact is that we know we can reduce carbon emissions now by scaling down our economies. Yeah. And yet somehow that's an impossibility to say to people, you can't have your second house, you can't have your new car, you can't have all of these things. That's impossible. Yeah. So we have to try to find a future where we understand our humanity in a different way. And to be honest, it's kind of sad that people think of themselves in such a narrow and such a childish way. If I basically, so much of it is, if I don't get my toys, I'm going to throw a tantrum. That's it. I want to eat hamburgers because I like the taste, and that's all. I don't care about anything else. And we're just going to keep on doing these things because we don't have the wisdom, or we don't have that idea of letting go. So I think that it's possible to live a good life and live a very full life with much fewer things. And I think that material comforts rapidly exhaust their potential. Having a clean place to stay with a roof over your head is great, and I definitely would not want to be without that. But then more and more, it just becomes a bit sad, the extent to which people just make more and more of these things. Humanity can be so much more, and we have to think of ourselves and try to understand our own human potential in a different way. And I'm just going to paraphrase one of my favorite politicians, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but when I went to New York after just before I came to Europe, when I arrived in New York and I met Venerable Sujato, and he said, "What do you want to do when you're in New York?" And I thought about it, and I said, "I want to meet Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez." And then they just laughed. I said, "What are you laughing at? I'm quite serious." So they got an email and sent her off an email to say if we can organize a meeting. Unfortunately, she was was touring the countryside campaigning with Bernie Sanders at the time. And I think she's very inspiring, and what she's done has really been incredible. One of the first things that I heard of her that really struck me as being very meaningful, and I'm paraphrasing here, so please don't quote me on it, but she was asked about the impact of automation and robotics on the workforce and whether that will put a lot of people out of work. And what she said, her response was something like this: the problem isn't that robots are going to put people out of work. The problem is that we've allowed ourselves to define our humanity in terms of what products that we can produce. And okay, and I can tell you, we don't have any politicians in Australia who are saying that kind of thing. And that's something where you hear somebody saying that it's not just smart, it's not just intelligent, that's actually wise. There's a wisdom to that. And this is pointing to, I guess, a theme that I'm trying to dig up or trying to reflect on through this series, is like, how do we see our own humanity? What kind of people do we want to be? And for all of the horrors and all of the terrible suffering that we've experienced so far with pandemic, with climate change, with all of these things, I don't think that they're going to get better. I think they're going to keep getting worse. In fact, there's no scientific projection that actually says that things are going to get better. All of the scientific projections on climate change say that things will continue to get much worse. And it's only a matter of how much worse. So this is what we're going to have to live with that. But this thing that we have here, this planet, with its trees and its bees, with its oceans, with its cockroaches, with its koalas, and yes, even with its human beings, this is still the best place to be. And if you don't like it, try the moon, try Mars, try living in space. There are beings who, thank you so much for the quote. So somebody sourced a quote for us. We should not be haunted by the spectre of being automated out of work. We should be excited by that. The reason we're not excited is because we live in a society where you don't have a job, you're left to die. And that is at its core our problem. Yeah, so thank you so much for sourcing that. Not quite what I said there, but that's the same kind of basic gist there. And so she's really kind of looking for a humanistic way of responding to it. So we should put people first rather than putting economies first. Economies are there to serve people. People are not there to serve the economy. So no matter how bad our planet gets over the next 100 years or 200 years, it's still going to be better than Venus. All right, we're not going to have like hundreds of degrees and sulfuric acid raining down from the sky. Okay, it's going to be much better than that. It's going to be a lot better than Jupiter. We're not going to have like hundreds of atmospheric pressures and no oxygen and so on. It's still going to be the best place in the neighborhood and for quite some way out of the neighborhood. And the sun's going to keep shining for the time being. The moon is going to stay there. And we have our lives to be lived. And if we live our life in a way that each moment is precious, then we can very easily find that in those simple moments of letting go, that there's a kind of happiness which is not so fragile and which is not so threatened by change. If we start practicing now about letting go, every meditation, every choice that we make, we start practicing with letting go, then we can start to learn that feeling of what the Buddha called nekama sukha, the happiness of letting go, the happiness of renunciation. That, I'm afraid to say, is going to be our most reliable source of joy in the future. Because there's going to come a point where we're not going to have a choice. We're going to have to let go. So we better get some practice in the meantime. So this is my talk for you today on the topic of joy. and the end of the world. I offer that for your reflection. And I'd just like to invite, if there's any comments or questions, you can pop them in the chat. I see there's some responses coming in the chat already, or just raise your hand there, and Tresia will look after you. On YouTube, Eleanor asks, is there a difference between feeling joyful, happy, or content? What practices would you recommend to increase happiness and contentment? Meditation on the things we're grateful for, maybe, probably not retail therapy. Yes, certainly the last one, not retail therapy. Okay, so difference between feeling joyful, happy, and content. Yes, of course, there's many differences between those in this very complex field. I don't like to try to pin these things down with words too much. Because what the words are means a lot of different things for different people. But I think we can think of like contentment as being a more kind of baseline kind of emotion, where you're not feeling that kind of need to fill your life with things. And that's more of a baseline. And once you have that baseline, then it's easy for joy to arise within that. And so in meditation, specifically, joy is an emotion, in Pali we call piti, is an emotion that arises when the conditions are there in the meditation. And it's not just like an absence of suffering. It's a powerful inner expression of that feeling of joy, and can be very kind of overwhelming feeling. So there's many different manifestations of joy in your path. So what practices would I recommend to increase happiness and contentment? Well, obviously meditation, obviously keeping your precepts and the whole of the Buddhist path. Specifically for myself, doing metta meditation was always the most powerful thing for bringing up joy. And I'm sure
live streaming is on.
Live streaming is back on. So I think that what I would say is that the only point that I'd probably make would be that like in this time, as we're facing all of these challenges, then it's very tempting, and something I hear a lot in the Buddhist sphere is people saying, "Oh, I can't read the news. I can't hear those things. I can't. It's too much." And I think that's fine to say that, but don't turn off completely. Like the information and so on that we can get through reading about climate change. Don't think of it as like something like an overwhelming torrent, which is going to just be too much for you. Think of it as a way of engaging with compassion, to understand what other people are going through. This is what we do when we listen to the news or we read the news. Don't do it too much, and you don't do it incessantly, but do it to some degree. And don't be afraid that your happiness is going to be destroyed because you hear about somebody else's pain. If that's the case, then your happiness is very brittle. And this is why we practice, so that we can hear these things. So again, you need to find your own balance and your own way with that, but don't be afraid of actually taking on board those negative things and those painful things, because that's part of our spiritual journey as well. But yeah, meditation on things we're grateful for is also another really beautiful meditation, and you can do that as a formal meditation, but also that's a really good one to use as a reflection. Like if you're traveling, if you're going through the city, just catching a bus or catching a train, then you can reflect about all the things that you're grateful for. And it's a really nice thing to be able to do. You can reflect that you're grateful to that car for putting their indicator on. That driver put their indicator on to say that they were going to change lanes. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you so much. And that driver doesn't even know that they just got a blast of metta from you. And all of the tiny little things. It reminds us that without all of these little things, what would it be like? We forget that actually most people most of the time are okay. Most people most of the time treat each other with kindness and decency. And that's why we notice those times when they don't. So don't lose sight of that. What we are, what human beings are. Yeah. Okay, so very good. So do we have any other thoughts or questions or reflections? So we got to 1 o'clock, so we're getting near the end of the session now, but I'd just like to see if anyone else has anything to add. Teresa asks, is joy as addictive as continuous grief? Yeah, it can be. Yeah. I mean, that's very provocative language there, right? To talk about it as being addictive. Normally, we only think of things that are bad as being addictive. Obviously, there are certain kinds of pleasure, and you mentioned that in the thing, but certain kinds of pleasure are obviously very addictive and create harmful senses. But yes, we can become addicted to the pleasure of letting go. Perhaps rather than being addicted to it, you can say you can become habituated to it, or you can become you just become used to it. It just becomes who you are. So the more that you do it, the more that you let go, then the easier it becomes. Okay, so Olivia asks, what's a skillful way to help our friends and family also see this joy in simple living and letting go, right? Yeah, very good one. And look, I don't necessarily have a lot of experience in this. My own family is, they live pretty simply, just up at my dad's place. He moved to his house, like a wooden place in the forest, about the same time as I became a monk, actually. And he's always been somebody who has found like joy in simple things, joy in nature, joy in other people. And when I was a kid, I remember one of the pieces of advice that he gave me. He said, in your life, do anything you do, do what it is that you want to do. But only one thing that I ask you to do in your life, never do anything for money. So I took him maybe a little bit more literally than he meant. But that gives you an idea of who he is as a father. And yeah, I've been thinking of reflecting on that, just going up there and seeing him now. One of the things that I realized that I never actually noticed before, but I realized that my father never taught me to be, never sort of transmitted any of this toxic masculinity crap to me. And he was never into this whole kind of macho thing, and it was never all of this kind of stuff. It was never a part of my life. I just grew up without it. And so I actually thanked him for that just a few days ago. I said, thank you for sparing me that burden of having to deal with all that kind of stuff. So for me, to try to help and to try to share these things with my family is more about just trying to encourage them, try to support them, try to set a good example. I understand it's going to be different for everybody else. And look, you can't do too much for your family. Sometimes you can just be there for them and just let them know that there's another, if they're going down a different path, then as long as they know that you'll always be there. If they want to take your path, then you'll always be there. All right. So Tara is asking about guilt and regret. Letting go of guilt and regrets without losing the lessons. Right. Yes. Well, that is the real way of letting go of guilt and regret, isn't it? Like, rather than trying to ignore it and distract yourself from it, but it's only when you've learnt the lesson that it will stop. It'll stop haunting you. And in Buddhism, like the attitude towards Buddhism we don't really have the idea of guilt as such. In Buddhism, we talk about kukucha as remorse. The literal Pali meaning, kukucha is kukritya, literal meaning is bad doneness. So it's the memory of something which has badly been done by you in the past. That the difference is that remorse is a recognition that you've made a mistake, that you've done bad things in the past, whereas guilt has more of an idea that you should punish yourself, that there's some kind of virtue in making yourself feel bad. So the way to handle these things actually is handled very beautifully, very elegantly in the formula that we as Buddhist monastics use when confessing our offenses. And so each fortnight we have a confession with the whole Sangha. And here I'm staying with Venerable Akaliko, so we'll confess to each other. And there's a few interesting features of that confession. Number one is the confession is always between equals. No matter how senior or junior a person is, that we're all equal when we do the confession, right? So there's not this kind of hierarchical relationship of confession like that. It's just everyone confesses to each other. The second thing is that when you confess, barring certain serious offences, but for the vast majority of offences, that we simply say what the offence is. We have to be specific about it and say we committed this kind of offence and so on, and we talk about what it did. Then we say we see it, we recognise it. This is number one. We recognise the offence, so we're not trying to pretend that it didn't exist. And then number two, sadhu. It's good, right? It's good that you see that. Sadhu, sangvarisami. And then we say, sangvarisami, I will restrain myself. Right? In the future, I will do better. Right? And we make that determination in our mind. So this is the thing, first of all, to recognize what it is that you've done. To congratulate yourself. Say, sadhu, you're good because you recognize that you made a mistake. Right? That means you're not a psychopath, right? You have a sense of morality. Good on you. That's integrity. That's moral integrity. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And next time I'm going to do better. Yeah, that's it. Okay, very good. So I had a couple of questions there and should probably be wrapping up about now, I think. As always, it's really wonderful to spend some time with all of you lot and friends that I've seen around the place and to catch up and to know that all around the world there are people who are sharing this kind of spiritual path. I hope that this session has been useful for you. And just to sort of reiterate the kind of theme, I'll come to Penny's question or Pavoy's question in 1 second, but just to reiterate what my purpose in doing this is, that I'm really hoping to try to open things up in a way that will help people to reflect on and accept and deal with the reality of the challenges that we're going to be facing. And so I'm not coming here to try to present you with simple or straightforward answers to things. I'm not trying to say this is what we have to do and this is a practice you can get and so on and so forth. I don't know. And nor does anyone else, because we've never been here before. All we can do is try to draw on the best wisdom that we know from the past, apply it in our experience, and then hope that's going to be helpful for the future. That's it. That's all I've got. All right. So Venerable Sumino has posted one last question. Pavoy from YouTube. How's it going, Pavoy? Hope you're doing well. Do you think the Arahant's psychic power or Vesakama, architect of Devas, would be greener or more eco-friendly in alternative building materials? Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point. For those of you who don't know what Pavoy is talking about, in the Vinaya, the monks were building a monastery at one point, and Venerable Mahamoggallana, who's the most renowned monk in psychic powers, got involved in the building project, and it was said that it was completed in record time. So he was able to handle the materials at a much quicker pace than using conventional methods. The builder of the gods, called Vesakamma. Vesakamma literally means just the all builder. And Vesakamma was the builder of the Sudhamma hall for Saka, the king of the gods. And would they use eco-friendly building materials? Yes, they would. And I know that. I'm not just making that up. Why? Because these stories about these people come from the past, and everyone in the past used more green materials. All right? Not just these guys, but literally everyone. And the only people who are living the way that we're living is us. And this is something that's it's really easy for us to forget, that what we're doing now is so incredibly weird. It's unutterably strange and completely different from how humanity has lived for thousands of years. And of course they were building things in a green way. Of course they would be harvesting local timbers that would be renewable. Of course. What else? Of course, they would be making some bricks from the local environment on a fairly small scale. You still see the brick kilns all over northern India that they would use. They would harvest grasses that would regrow in the area. Of course, they were doing that. That was the only thing that existed. And humanity for thousands of years has known that we have to live with the environment and with the world in a gentle way that doesn't destroy things. We haven't always done that, and there are plenty of examples of civilizations that have overstretched it, and this happened back as far as the Indus Valley or the Khmer Empire or Egypt, and multiple times where we used up the environment too much and the civilization collapsed. But for most times, in most places, we operated within our means. And by remembering the lessons of those past, then this is how we're going to be able to forge a way into the future as well. Yeah. So thank you for that question. All right.